afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are again. Welcome to the Charleston Festival. I'm Virginia Nicholson, for those of you who haven't got used to this boring introduction. In case you've just arrived for the event, I'm Deputy Chairman of the Charleston Trust. Now, Charleston Festival regulars will, I hope, have booked for this event knowing that they were in for a rare treat. If Michael's latest book, Skios, is anything to go by, they're completely right. Sitting opposite my embarrassed teenage daughter on the Lewis to London train a few weeks ago, she had to literally beg me to stop my helpless and increasingly audible giggling as I turned the pages of Skios, at which I then had to remind her that we'd all nearly wet ourselves at the family Christmas outing to Michael's revived production of Noises Off just a few months earlier. To be honest, I can't think of a funnier novelist and playwright than Michael Frayn. Though, of course, that is not his only talent. He's also famous for his almost alarming erudition and versatility. His plays Copenhagen and Democracy dealt with philosophy, science, and politics. He's written funny novels, fairly serious novels, essays, memoirs, and journalism, and he's a foremost translator from Russian. Joining him on the platform today is another absolute Charleston favourite, of course, Lynne Truss, who usually arrives here at festival time looking quite unreasonably suntanned from her annual sojourn on a Greek island. That and the fact that she too is one of the funniest and cleverest authors writing in English today more than qualify her, I think, to chat to Michael Frayn about his new novel, Skios, set somewhere in the Aegean, I think, with a special authority. So, for this launch platform event for Skios, I'm going to hand over in a moment to Michael, who will first of all talk about the book. Lynn will then join him and they'll have a conversation and take it from there. Welcome back to them both. And my advice is, if they don't make you laugh, ask for your money back.
When I first started writing farces and did this kind of occasion, the interviewers would sometimes ask me why I wrote farce, why didn't I write about life as it really was?
Yes.
So there's the next book already set up. Okay, you go to some other country, you arrive at the airport, and you emerge from passport control and customs. What's the first thing you see of the country, whichever country it is? Well, I tell you, you see a line of the local citizens holding up cards with people's names on, and they're drivers, taxi drivers, limousine drivers, and so forth, waiting for particular people to come off the plane. Have you ever been tempted to go up to someone who's holding up a name which is not yours and say that it is? You know that you have an advantage. You can see the names and you would recognize your own name if it was there. You know, you can be reasonably sure the drivers don't know what you look like, or they wouldn't be holding up a card with your name on it, just recognize you. Well, every time I've arrived at an airport in the last 20 or 30 years, I've thought about doing this. And then 2 or 3 years ago, my wife and I went on holiday on a Greek island. Not Skios, which no one has ever had a holiday on, as far as I know, although several people who've seen the title of the book have claimed they do know Skios. But I don't think it existed until I began work on this book. We arrived for this holiday, and I was just starting work on my previous book, My Father's Fortune, which was a memoir of my father, absolutely nothing to do with Greek islands or farce or anything. And what I should have been thinking about was that book. But you know how perverse one's mind is. When one's supposed to be thinking about A, one's mind immediately leaps to thinking about B. And as we emerged from customs and we saw the line of people, I remembered a friend I'd had years ago who was bipolar. And he was like the Grand Old Duke of York. When he was down, he was really down. But when he was up, my God, he was sky high. And he once told me that in one of his up periods, he'd been walking along Fleet Street, he was a journalist, very heavy, slow-moving traffic beside him. And he realized that the car that was absolutely parallel with him had white ribbons on, and in the back was the bridal couple sitting happily together. And he knew instantly, it just came to him, that what they wanted him to do was to get into the back of the car with them and chat to them about his life. So he did, and no doubt made their wedding day. No doubt somewhere in some corner of England they're talking to each other even at this very moment saying, you remember that fellow who got in the back of the car with us on our wedding day? And it made the day absolutely full. Well, I thought, supposing he was arriving and not me, what would he do? And I thought he would do what I've always wanted to do. Well, one of the wonderful things about writing fiction is you have assistants, staff of people, and you can give them any qualities you like. And of course, writers do give qualities to their characters that they don't have themselves. And their characters are often much braver than they are. They're happy to go out and tackle the enemy on the battlefield, or climb mountains, or commit crimes, rob banks. And I thought it only too likely that one of my assistants would arrive at a foreign airport and indeed let it be believed that he was some character that he was not. So my man arrives on the Greek island of Skios, and for various complicated reasons, the person he's expecting to meet is not there, so he looks along the line of names, and he sees the name Dr. Norman Wilfrid, and he thinks, that sounds a rather nice name. And he imagines Dr. Norman Wilfrid's life, and he thinks he'd be a nice country doctor somewhere, looked up to by his patients and so forth. And it comes to him immediately that he is Dr. Norman Wilfrid. And it doesn't hurt that the person who is holding up the sign is a rather attractive young lady. So the question in the book is simply, as it would be for oneself, how far does he get with this before he is rumbled? Well, he has a certain difficulty. There are many, many novels and plays about mistaken identity. But mostly, when there's a question of mistaken identity, people know what the identity is that they're trying to assume. People do it in real life. Spies pretend to be people they're not. Undercover policemen pretend to be criminals. Journalists pretend to be criminals, and so on. But they always have an idea of the target. They've got some idea of the person they're trying to pass themselves off as. Well, my man has set himself a harder task because he hasn't the faintest idea of who Dr. Norman Wilfrid is, or what sort of person he is, and he just has to feel his way through it as he goes along. So it's not very likely he's going to get very far. So that's one side of the story. The other side, of course, is that if there is a false Dr. Norman Wilfrid knocking around the airport on Skios, somewhere there must be another Dr. Norman Wilfrid who has a passport written in that name. But he had a disadvantage because he is the second comer. He is the second claimant to the title. And it's always hard to be the second person in the queue for something. So he has been set a problem by the slight less than honesty of my first character, who's called Oliver Fox, incidentally. And the question is, what happens to him? So that's how the novel begins, and Lynn is now going to tell us what the whole thing means thereafter.
Oh, right, jolly good. This is a very interesting new development for Charleston, so I hope it works. It's never been attempted before, but I have, in fact, prepared a PowerPoint to show the first few scenes of Skios. And Michael hasn't seen this, so I really, really hope... Oh, here we are, the plot of Skios, a visual aid by Lynne Truss. So next slide, please. So this is Skios Airport, where, as you can see, I very helpfully... I've labelled everything very carefully. And then next slide. These represent Oliver Fox here, who looks like Alan Shearer, but it's actually Oliver Fox, and Dr. Wilfrid, who looks like Captain Cook. That's Dr. Wilfrid, and they are at the airport. Next slide, please. This is Nikki. Isn't she lovely? This is Nikki, who's gone to the airport. Next slide, please. And she's supposed to take him to the foundation, where he's to give a lecture. Shall I move? Oh, okay. But I need the... Oh, no, I don't know what I can do. Can you not see that one? Can I take this with me? I think it might be... Oh, okay. Oh, you're right. Oh, it's the pot. It's the pot. Sorry. Is this on? Can you hear me? Okay. So this is the foundation where Dr. Wilfrid is supposed to be going. And the next slide. And this is a villa, which is where Oliver Fox is supposed to be going. And then, next slide. At the airport, as we see, Nikki sees Oliver Fox and doesn't see Dr. Wilfrid. We're still at the airport. And then this is where Oliver makes his choice, and he sees all these people, and he sees Nikki, and when she says, "Are you Dr. Wilfrid?" he says, faithfully, "I cannot tell a lie." So next slide. And off they go, leaving Dr. Wilfrid at the airport. It's very Greek. Look, it's really, I did loads of work on this. So Dr. Wilfrid is stranded at the airport. Next slide. And so, at the foundation, there's Oliver with Nikki, and at the airport, there's still Dr. Wilfrid. I'm very proud of this one. Dr. Wilfrid takes Oliver's taxi, Greek taxi, that's a Greek taxi, thinking to the villa, thinking he's being taken to the foundation. Next one. And meanwhile, the sexy Georgie, who we haven't mentioned yet, arrives at the villa to meet Oliver. I love Georgie. Here you go. Another one. And so at the villa, Georgie gets into bed with Dr. Wilfrid, which is a mistake. Next slide. And she locks herself in a bathroom, very Greek bathroom. She's here, where she calls Nick. We're not going to do the whole book. Where she calls Nikki, who is an old friend. Next slide. And Nikki is unable to help. She's got a lot to do. And I come into a problem here because we need lots of honoured guests at the foundation. So next slide. That's all I could manage, actually. This little group here of honoured guests at the foundation. And then next slide. Just thought I'd show you the honoured guests because I think they're very funny. And they're not as suspicious as they look. But, and then next slide. The end. As figures. Next slide. One more slide. And there's one more slide. The cast. Yay!
So there, we got to the feature film already.
So is that how you visualised it? That's what I really wanted to know.
You've seen my characters precisely like
But I imagine, what everyone is always so amazed by is your capacity to imagine where everybody is, who's got the suitcase, who's doing that. I mean, how do you keep that all in your mind?
with difficulty. I tried when I first started writing farces to have a little model theatre with little model characters on it. But the trouble is, the story keeps changing faster than you can change the set, change the characters on the stage. So it's always out of date. And difficult as it is, it's easier just to remember where they are and do it that way.
Obviously, it's wonderful that you've written another straightforwardly pure comic novel, and everyone's very, very happy about it. But it is an odd thing, I think, for an odd choice, in a way, to want to do a farce in book form. This is quite a daring thing to do. Right. And also, I wondered why. I wondered whether it was partly that comic novelists are always supposed to get more serious as they get older. So you thought, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to write a comic novel. Well, anyway, you tell me.
Well, I'd like to claim that I had these good strategic thoughts about my career. What next? What shall I do? But it's not like that. Ideas just come or they don't come. If an idea comes and you're arriving at the airport on the island we did arrive on, and you think of someone arriving and making that kind of claim, then you either write the story or you don't, and you haven't much other choice. And if it's a farcical story, then it presumably comes out as a farcical novel.
I mean, one thing, as you said, that you can do in a novel that you can't perhaps do on stage is you can have a character like Oliver Fox who does something random, really, at the beginning, whereas in a play, that wouldn't work, would it? If someone did something that set everything else in motion but wasn't really explicable.
Well, that's a very interesting thought. I've never actually thought about it like that, but perhaps you couldn't, no. One of the obvious differences between novels and plays is that plays are vastly shorter than novels. A very short novel is 60,000 words. That's a very short novel. And a very long play is 20,000 words. So plays are much more concentrated than novels. And maybe part of the aesthetic of a play is that it's got to not seem arbitrary. And maybe you can sort of put more arbitrary strokes into a novel.
I loved you talking about Oliver Fox and where that came from, and putting yourself into that kind of mind that just keeps on, because it's quite scary when you're reading it. You just feel, I can't believe he's really going to pull this off. What's so lovely as well is the way that other people treat him because they believe that he's a great expert.
Yeah.
And he's able to say all sorts of nonsense to them, and they completely buy it because they believe in him.
Because he seems like an attractive character, and they'd be expecting to meet some extremely boring old scientist who's going to talk to them in ways they can't understand. And when they meet this young man who speaks perfectly comprehensibly, they're delighted. But some people have challenged us and said, surely no one was going to believe that this young idiot is a respectable middle-aged scientist. But I think one does, on the whole, accept people at face value. And people have said, well, in these days, you can Google. Why didn't they Google and find out what he was like? Well, how many of you here have Googled me or Lynn and checked that we are the real item? I mean, not too many, I guess. It's not what you do. It's if you say you're Lynne Truss, I say I'm Michael Frayn, people on the whole accept it, unless there's some particular reason for not accepting it.
And actually, there's an element of wishful thinking as well at the beginning, isn't there? Because Nikki is hoping that Dr. Wilfrid isn't a boring old scientist. She's rather hoping she'll see someone it will be a surprise.
Absolutely, yeah.
But I did think, coming after My Father's Fortune, which is such a wonder, I loved it so much, My Father's Fortune. It's made me weep twice, and I think it's very, very powerful book. And I just wondered if it was, having dealt with that material and thought about it so deeply and honestly, and bared so much, that in a way it was lovely to go back into the world of people doing things,
Yes, I suppose it was. It is. This is fun, writing comedy and farce. It's rather strenuous fun, I have to say. It's rather hard work, but it is enjoyable, and one does get carried away by the plot and by the characters and the possibilities of the characters. It's not really so extraordinary what Oliver Fox does, because it's a slight exaggeration of what we all do all the time. We're all passing ourselves off as somebody. I mean, I'm passing myself off as an author, you're passing yourself off as another author. And we just, we're in some ways, like Oliver Fox, we're picking up the clues from each other as to what we expect, what you expect of me, what I expect of you, what they expect of us, and so forth. And they're politely, because they're extremely polite people, behaving like an audience who come to the festival, and not throwing beer bottles and shouting and drunkenly and so forth. And that's the way we do. We all do this. We all try and present something to the world which seems reasonably plausible, and on the whole, that character is accepted.
Where are your sympathies in the book? Do you sympathise with the plight of Dr. Wilfrid, who has been stripped of his identity, and he ends up in this terrible... one of my favourite passages is when he's woken up in the morning in the wrong place, but he doesn't know he's in the wrong place. So he phones reception at Foundation and says, I'm here and I don't know where to go for breakfast. And they say, oh, well, just walk down the path. And so he just walks down the path in the villa, and of course he just comes across some goats and things, doesn't he? And there's no breakfast. And at the same time as we sort of slightly despise him for being such a sort of pampered, international jet-setting bore, you know, but nevertheless, you do feel terribly sorry for him that he's in this. But did you feel, who did you feel most sympathy with?
Who did I feel most sympathy with? I think I felt most sympathy with Oliver Fox, because he's doing not only what we all do, but he's doing what I do professionally. I mean, he's making up a character, and I spent most of my life inventing characters. I can't help but have some sort of professional fellow feeling for someone who's doing the same.
I love it when he's asked by, he is actually pinned down at one point by an academic person.
Tedious man who actually knows something about the
Yes.
subject and has actually read a book by the real Norman Wilfrid. Yeah, Wilfrid
And
Norman.
he asked him sort of to the exact. Hang on, I've got it here because I thought it was very funny. He asked him. Oh yes, well, am I right? In the footnote of your statistical methodology, you assign a value of between 7 and 10 to the theta function in a Wechsler distribution. Given that lambda is negative and mu is greater than phi, this will yield a solution remarkably close to Theobald's constant. Now, my question to you, sir, is exactly how close? Oh, said Dr. Wilfrid, as close as a dog and a flea.
Well, I have to say, I was doing an event earlier this week in the Guardian Book Club, but not about this book, but about Spies, which I wrote a long time ago, and I've slightly forgotten now. And one of the conditions for entrance, apparently, to the Guardian Book Club, I mean, you actually have to sit an exam, but you have to have read the book that the person's going to be talking about. And it turned out that everyone in the audience knew far more about the book than I did. And they were all asking this kind of question. They were all saying, on page 97, so-and-so says something, what did you mean by that? I have no idea what I meant by it, or what the character meant by it, or what I'd actually written on the page at all. So it can arise.
One thing that's a factor, a common factor in many books, including Spies, I think, is the way you really brilliantly focus on a chain of events, you know, how and their origin. So in Spies, you focus on those words. My mother is a German spy, and from that everything went. And in this book, obviously as well. I mean, it's obviously a real fascination of yours, isn't it? It's this causality, how one thing leads to another.
Yes. But also how the chain of causality can be disrupted by arbitrary events, like somebody inventing something, like the little boy in Spies who invents this game. Suddenly it comes into his head that to say his mother's a German spy. And it suddenly comes into Oliver Fox's head to claim that he's somebody he's not. And that's one of the arguments of the book. The real scientist is a rather old-fashioned determinist, and he sees the laws of physics as providing a framework of causality which has steered us from the Big Bang to the present moment. And the causality works as causality all through the book, except that at some point some idiot has put a foot wrong and invented something which has messed up the whole chain of cause and effect. Well, that's what human beings do all the time, it seems to me. Human beings, I can't believe that human beings are simply acting as the effects of causes. Sometimes human beings do think of ideas for themselves. They do invent things. And that invention does start a completely new causal chain.
And as a writer, though, I mean, when you are exploring a plot, I imagine that you didn't, well, you do explore it, even if you plan it first and you then write it, you still have to explore it. And it is always about what must happen next, isn't it? It's not what does happen next, it's what must. Do you think?
Well, once you've got the plot going, I think you can't have too many totally arbitrary strokes. But in this book, the whole causal structure having been set up for a particular result, it is another arbitrary intervention, and not even really an invention this time, just a velleity, a passing fancy into someone's head that completely deflects the whole plot again before you get there.
One of the big difference, obviously, about writing a novel that's a farce is that you don't have an audience that laughs together, or, and in fact, you don't know whether the reader could put the book down, you know, when someone's halfway through a door, someone's coming in from the bathroom. You know, you have no control over that.
You don't know, and you don't know, fortunately, whether they're hurling the book across the room in irritation, saying this isn't funny at all. I have a friend who, Stanley Price, who began as a novelist, and he was sitting on a train one day and realised, on an underground train on the Piccadilly line, and he realised the man opposite him was reading one of his novels. So he sat there absolutely fascinated by this, and as he watched, the man laughed, and Stanley Price's life changed at that moment. He remained on the train all the way to Cockfosters. And then he went home and started writing plays.
Very good.
And there is something taking about sitting in an audience watching one of your plays, and they're laughing at things. But of course, the corollary is also true that when you sit in an audience and they're not laughing at your play, it is extremely painful.
When my first time I wrote for the Times, when I was very young, I wrote an interview with Mariah Aitken. It was on the arts page, and I sat opposite someone the next morning on the train who opened it at that page, folded it back, sat down, started to read it, and then looked out of the window for the rest of it. That taught me a lesson.
But it's quite true. If you've got something in the paper, like a review of something you've done or an interview of something, if you see someone reading the paper, they always turn over the page without looking at your bit.
I think you've probably answered this question a bit, but I think you've got an absolutely brilliant way of knowing when you write a novel, when you write a play, when you write a sketch, and so on. I mean, it just seems to be, and I just wonder, you know, where that instinct comes from. I suppose practice is one obvious answer.
Well, I think there are obvious differences between the two. One I mentioned earlier, that novels are simply longer than plays, so you have a more chance to put diversions and byways and things in. But the other main difference, which I'm sure I've talked about here at least 8 times before, is that in a novel, it's absolutely natural for the writer to know what his characters are thinking and feeling. Doesn't have to, but when you think about most of the books you've read, it's full of things like, he decided to do so-and-so, she felt bitter resentment at what he'd said, etc. Which implies the author knows everything about what's going on inside the characters' heads. Well, on the stage you can't do that. All we know in the theatre is what the characters tell us and what they demonstrate by their actions. And of course they can tell us what they're thinking and feeling, but then we have to believe that they're telling us the truth, which I regret to say characters in plays don't always do, and that they understand themselves. And a lot of plays are about just that very thing, of characters who don't understand themselves, who were brought by the action of the play to have a better understanding of their own natures. So that's a very fundamental difference. In Spies, it had to be a novel because we needed to know what the little boy thought he was seeing in front of his eyes. And I wrote a play called Copenhagen, which was about why the German physicist Werner Heisenberg went to visit his old friend Niels Bohr in Copenhagen in 1941 during the war, very embarrassing, etc. And the whole question of the play was, why did he go? What was his motivation? Well, if it had been a novel, I should have simply said, Werner Heisenberg decided to go to Copenhagen in order to say this and that to Niels Bohr, and that would have been the end of the novel, the first paragraph. Well, I wanted to keep the story going a bit longer than that, so it had to be a play.
And there are certain jokes that only work in certain forms. I reread The Russian Interpreter, and in that there's a joke that could not work in any other form, which is because of the convention in it, that the people speaking Russian in it, it's conveyed in English. The Russian interpreter interprets into Russian, and back into English, and so on. And there's a moment when he is a bit drunk, and he's at a function, and they say, could you tell our hosts that I'm very pleased to be here, that blah, 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 you know. And he just says, it's fine, you know, yes, they're happy to be here. But it's in a very perfunctory way. And then his friend says to him, do you realise you just said that in English? And he doesn't realise he's just said it in English. And because it's on the page, that's the only place that joke would work, isn't it? Because you couldn't put that into...
That's quite true. And what worries him is he reveals the very hit and miss standards of his translations when it turns out to be a rather crude paraphrase in English. But that was based on a real incident. I was in Moscow as a student at Moscow University, and we had one of those appalling Soviet dinners where the endless toast to international friendship or whatever, and I have to confess I got rather drunk. And the woman next to me, who was also at the university, was a French crystallographer, said to me she wanted to make a speech. People kept standing up and making speeches. And would I translate it for her? So I said, fine. So she made a speech in French, which I realized the following morning when I woke up with a terrible hangover in Leningrad, having been on the overnight train all night. I realized I'd translated into English instead of Russian. But it didn't seem to make much difference. Every time I raised my glass, everybody else raised their glasses. And we got through very well. And I started to think, why did I waste all that time learning Russian in the first place?
I also wonder, I mean, I know, you usually work a lot with actors and so on. Did you have any actors, any particular kind of people you would see as Dr. Wilfrid or Oliver Fox? I mean, did you have a sort of model for those?
No, I didn't. I don't think even if you're writing a play, you can start thinking about characters as particular actors or whatever, because you never get those actors. Whatever actors you have in mind, you always end up with somebody else. I think also the limitations of my brain are such, and the demands of writing a story are such, that I can only think about the story when I'm writing. I can't think about, which casting or publication possibilities, or is this going to advance my career, or will I make any money out of this? There just isn't enough brain space left over. So all I can do is think about the characters. But the characters do help you out. They do seem to take on a life of their own, and they do suggest, they do seem to begin to talk and do things of their own accord. And if you're doing a farcical plot like Skios or Noises Off, it's quite difficult because you've worked out these elaborate possibilities for them. And they're not always as grateful as they should be. They have their own ideas, like Oliver Fox in this, and they start saying things and doing things which are incompatible with the plans you've got for them. And I sometimes think that writing fiction is a bit like industrial management, that you've got this workforce who are trying to persuade to carry out your plans for production and so forth, and they've got their own ideas. They want time off and they want to do as little work as possible. And somehow you've got to either bully them or cajole them or persuade them or bribe them to do, at any rate, some of what you want.
Oh, that's wonderful. Should we have some questions from the audience? I'm sure you've got many.
And please don't say on page 94.
Yes, here's more.
Thank you for that fantastic discussion, dropping the book on the floor. It was wonderful. I want to ask a different kind of question, which is really kind of topographical one, because I often go to a real and wonderful Greek island called Skios, which is Skios with an R in the middle, a bit like an oyster in the month, I suppose. And Skios has been famed since antiquity as the island where Odysseus found Achilles dressed in a frock and got hauled off to Troy. And Homer also called Skios the island inaccessible to goats. But if you go there today, there are more goats than people. But there's also an alternative holiday centre there where many people, including me, have had pretty life-changing experiences. And I was so intrigued by these stories that people were telling all the time, and the way the island facilitated that I wrote a book about it last year, which I published, and is called Skios. No. Your book might boost my sales enormously. I'm not sure if it works the other way around.
Or the other way around.
Well, I wish it would. But I played it very straight in my book, although the Skios Centre, as you can imagine, does provide ample scope for satire. And indeed, they run writers' labs where lots of eminent writers have come and have written marvellous comic stories about the life-changing experiences and the goats and so on, including D.M. Thomas, Hanif Qureshi, Sue Townsend, have all written marvellously about it. And of course, I'm just dying to know, did you know about Skios and have you been there?
I think the only time I've been to Skios was getting off a plane and getting onto a hydrofoil to go to another island called Alonissos. Would be Skios where you change for Alonissos?
Long ride.
Oh. Perhaps it was Skopilos. Right. I can't recall. I certainly haven't been to the Writers' Centre there. I think probably at the back of my mind there was some recollection of reading about the Writers' Centre there. But the title has, as always, created difficulties with, not with my British publisher, Fabo, entirely happy with it, for once, but with my American publisher, who said no one in America can have the faintest idea what Skios means. And with my German publisher, who got it into our head that Skios was the English pronunciation of another Greek island, which I think is pronounced Xios, isn't it? Written with a Greek X, yeah. Yes. And we had an incredibly cross-purposes debate about this for a long time. I think it's reasonably... I think you can guess that Skios is some kind of Greek island.
It's a good picture, tells you as well.
I'm appalled that you've written a book called Skios.
The picture tells you as well, doesn't it?
The picture tells you as well.
The picture tells you, really. Yes. Yes.
Dismissed by my German publisher as too kitschy, the jacket. I said, please use this nice English jacket. But the terrible fear of the kitschy in Germany, and they wouldn't do this. So they got a nice mud brown cover, which is...
Yeah, something else. There's another here.
Thank you so much for that. It was fascinating, and I actually finished reading the book last night, so it was fantastic. I was intrigued with your reference to industrial management and the difficulties of forcing the workforce to do what you want them to do. Could you just talk a little bit more about your planning of the novel and the complex, who loses their trousers where, with the characters' own ideas about how they would want to lose their trousers or their suitcases?
I can't. I had pretty detailed planning of this book, but I can't remember exactly what the original plans were because they got replaced by what was written. And I can't remember whether I originally intended a character called Annika Voss to actually turn up in the book. I thought she might be a background character, but suddenly she thrust her way to the front of the stage in a rather forceful manner.
Yes.
I simply cannot recall what got changed as I went along, sadly. I can tell you that when I wrote Noises Off originally as part farce and part serious play, and that in the original version that we began playing 30 years ago at the Lyric Hammersmith, halfway through Act 3, it turns into a serious play about the meaning of life. And at the end of the first preview, we knew that the audience did not wish to hear about the meaning of life. At that point in the evening, I then had to think of another ending for the play, and I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote and rewrote the ending, trying to make it work without the meaning of life stuff. It was quite difficult.
That's pretty fascinating. Yes, there's someone here.
Hello. I love your bipolar man. And I can't resist asking, because I presume he didn't end up being Oliver, but would you put a bipolar person in either one of your farces or your books? Because I think in Noises Off, I think they all become bipolar by the end.
Well, it's a very good question. When I first started thinking about this book, I thought Oliver probably was bipolar, and in fact I read a couple of textbooks on bipolarity. But I thought really the depressive aspect was not part of the story. And I also thought that some of the things that people do bipolar people do when they're high are much more extraordinary than this, vastly more extraordinary. And that really, this was the shallows of bipolarity, and I thought maybe I shouldn't try to make it some kind of textbook case. I should just imply that Oliver was somewhat given to these extravagant ideas that bipolar people are. But one of the things that bipolar people often do is buy stuff. They buy vast quantities of things that they couldn't possibly need. And it's one of the problems that wives and husbands of bipolar people have of coping with this. Seeing all the family's money go on stuff that they don't want.
Here's one.
You talked about the way in novels you can tell what people are thinking, and that in plays they're not always thinking what they seem to be thinking. It seems to me that one of the things you do brilliantly, both on the stage and in novels, is that distance between what the reader knows and what the character says or does or thinks. So that, for instance, something like Noises Off actually depends, all the jokes depend on what we already know somewhere else. So the joy of it is partly what's happening on stage, but it's also it's all happening in our heads. We're making all the connections because we know what happened on the other side or why the person has appeared, what they're trying to do on the stage and whatever at the same time. I think that's a very difficult thing to write the kind of satire you have in, say, Towards the End of the Morning, where we appreciate the awfulness of characters because we know that they're meant to be an awful character rather than a likeable character and so on. How did you learn to do that distance? Is it a difficult tightrope walk, if you like, between making the character literal and making the audience know something else? I always find that a very puzzling thing for writers to do.
I think it's always a nice thing in plays and in books when the readers or the audience are ahead of the characters. In Spies, for instance, I don't think any adult reader would accept the interpretation the little boy is putting on events in front of his eyes. The reader's ahead of it. So it's the kind of converse of a traditional detective story where the detective is very smart and we're dumb, and they're thinking of the detective is inventing solutions which we're too dumb to follow. But of course it's a great tradition in the theatre, and one of the most wonderful things in children's pantomime is when the man says, tell me when the broker's men are behind me or whatever. And so the children shout out, he's behind you. And the character is just too slow to see them. Every time he turns around, it's just too late and the bad character's gone. But I'll tell you how I learnt to do it. Through hard experience in life, from realizing that almost everyone in the world is smarter than me. I'm realizing that when I'm talking to people, they understand things and know things that I don't. So I've predicted this. I've sort of defense mechanism really against this embarrassing situation of making it into what happens to fictitious characters.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Oh, it's Bill.
I know this is a funny book, but if you are also a very serious and profound writer, when you look at it, having written it, presumably aiming for the laughs, do you then realize afterwards that actually you're always touching on something far more serious, possibly far more painful, far more real, that underlies the laughter? And are you conscious of that? And if so, in Skios, what is it?
Well, fortunately, I only noticed after the event that all my books and plays are about exactly the same thing. I plagiarize myself over and over again. They're all about how people impose interpretations on the world or attempt to impose interpretations on the world to make sense of it. and either manage it or fail to. Each time I think of a story, the story seems to be completely new. No one's ever thought of anything like this in the world before. Then you come to an event like this and discover that somebody has written a book with almost precisely the same title. And you've thought of this wonderful title like Peace and War or whatever, and it turns somebody's got there before you. So I think it's yet another example of everyone else in the world knowing more than I do. Everyone else knows that there's a book called War and Peace. Everybody else knows there's a book called Skios. And I don't. So fortunately, I never discovered until too late that it's yet again about how we make sense of the world. So all these boring philosophical questions that people would run a mile from if they realised that was what the book was about.
You assisted. I mean, you in fact are an extremely smart person who knows exactly what you're doing, and you must know that the pain is the laughter is always on the edge of our own feeling that these characters are going to get into incredibly painful and difficult circumstances, and that's what makes it intense.
Well, I'll tell you how smart I am. I was in Istanbul with my wife on holiday, and we were having a terrible time. The weather was terrible, the food was terrible, the hotel was horrible, absolutely everything was awful, and we couldn't communicate with anyone because I couldn't speak any Turkish. And we were walking through the streets one day looking for the Blue Mosque. And a man came up to me, an extremely sinister-looking man with blue lips, and said something in German like Hilfe or Helfen or whatever. And I was so pleased to discover there was someone who could speak German, which I can speak a bit of, that I said we're looking for the Blue Mosque. And he indicated that he would take us there. So he led the way to the Blue Mosque, and he explained, in extremely broken German, that he had once worked in the BMW plant in Munich. I was so delighted at last to be able to speak to someone there, in spite of the fact that my German was almost as bad as his. And eventually we arrived on a huge piece of empty ground in front of the Blue Mosque. And he said, "Geld." So I thought, reasonable, he wants some tip for his help. So I got out my wallet and peeled off a low-denomination Turkish banknote and gave it to him. And he made gestures of heaven. The last thing in his mind was money. All he wanted to do was to show me that on a Turkish banknote there's a picture of Atatürk, the founder of the Turkish state. So I said, "Oh, Atatürk, Atatürk." He said, "Atatürk." I said, "Atatürk." And he said, "Mergel, Mergel." So I got out another Turkish banknote, and he demonstrated that there was a picture of Atatürk on that. And eventually, by slow degrees, we got to the situation where he was holding all my Turkish banknotes and had demonstrated conclusively that there was a picture of Atatürk on every denomination of Turkish banknote. So I was entirely happy with this arrangement. And then he said, "English is geld, English is geld." So I got my wife up and took out a £10 note, and he said, "Nicht Atatürk, nicht Atatürk." I said, no. He said, "Mehr English is geld, mehr English is geld." So I got another one. Eventually, he was holding all my Turkish banknotes in one hand, all my English banknotes in the other, and he had absolutely proved his case. Atatürk on every denomination of Turkish banknote, no Atatürk on any denomination of English banknotes. And at this point, he indicated someone in the far distance of this empty piece of ground in front of the Blue Mosque and said, mein Freund, and demonstrated that he was going to go and show them to his friend. Well, I was entirely happy with this arrangement. I thought, all in favour of increasing international understanding and understanding of the currency and so forth. At this point, my wife said, "Get it back!" So that's why I think that sometimes I'm not quite as smart as the people around me.
Thank you. Anyone have a question? Any questions? Oh, there's someone over here. Thank you. Wonderful story.
I'm really enjoying your book. I'm about 3/4 of the way through. And I don't mean this question to be in any way negative implication, but I was wondering, to what extent do you rely on an editor to read it through and see whether all the complicated strands of your plot actually cohere from the point of view of the reader?
I do. I rely a lot on 4 editors. I rely a lot on my editor at Faber in London and my extremely tough American editor, American editors have a reputation for savagery and fury, and she is absolutely entirely happy to say, this isn't funny, take it out, which my English editor would never dream of saying. And 2 other editors, my wife, Claire Tomlin, and my eldest daughter, Rebecca Frayn, who also writes books. And they're all the other 3, apart from my American editor, are very polite about what they put in. But all 4 of them persuaded me to make considerable changes to this book. They thought it was too complicated, and they persuaded me to take out entire plot strands. And some of the reviewers have complained, even so, that it's too complicated. Well, possibly, but you should have seen it before they started to stop working.
It's very easy to be blind to things. If you've changed the character's name or something, you often can read it and read it and read it and not see that someone who started off called Judith at the beginning has changed to Lillian later on.
Absolutely.
And you just haven't noticed.
People's eyes change colour.
Yeah.
Yes, I know. It's only too easy. Yeah. I was, in fact, in the middle of Selina Hastings's biography of Evelyn Waugh, and she points out that in Brideshead Revisited, Waugh has often used the name, not Sebastian, but the name of the character that Sebastian was based on, a friend of his called Alistair. And often in the manuscript it says Alistair instead of Sebastian.
Yes. Oh, that's moving. Here. Yes, I thought. I
Like an actor who's gone through film after film. Do I need this? That you've written about so many, such a range of characters, such a range of issues, that you actually don't know who you are. Does that ever occur to you?
After all this range of stuff I've written about, do I know who I am? I'm not sure I ever did, even before I started in all this performance. And I think, I think you do find, when you invent characters, they do, of course, have something in common with oneself. If they didn't have some aspects of themselves in them, one wouldn't be able to write about them. Just as when actors come to play them, if they're in plays, they have to find something in themselves that chimes with that character. They have to see what common ground they can find with the character. So all characters as played by actors, when the same character played by different actors is always different. But we don't go around, do we, thinking about who am I and I'm this sort of person or that sort of person, or do we? Perhaps we do.
No, we do. I'm always worried when when you fill in the form sometime and it asks you for your title, and as being a woman, I often don't want to put Miss or Ms or anything, and I put other, and then they will address you as other Lynne Truss. It will actually come in the post. And that's worrying. That's when you worry, who am I? There is another, I'm other Lynne Truss. Oh, no.
I was in Germany last weekend, being looked after by a German academic who specialised in my work, who is called Frau Professor Dr. Bach. And when she got the draft of the new telephone book, she couldn't find herself on the B for Bach, and found herself on the D for Dr. Bach. Isn't that extraordinary? But there used to be the case in Sweden that people were listed in alphabetical order by their profession. The name came first, but then their profession. So Bach Doctor would have come as Bach Doctor before Bach Suzanne Doctor would have come before Bach Astrid something or other. And it was extremely difficult. If you wanted to look someone up in the Stockholm telephone directory, if it was a common name like Svensson or whatever, you had to know whether they were a surgeon or a bus driver or whatever before you had any hope of finding them.
Yeah, yes.
Thanks. I just wanted to... you write in so many different genres, and you revisit those genres very frequently, but to the best of my knowledge, and I may be incorrect, but to the best of my knowledge, you've never gone back to your very original genre, which was writing sketches for The Guardian, very often based on parliamentary shenanigans. I wondered whether you're ever tempted to do that, particularly given the sort of current unravelling of, various journalistic and parliamentary institutions.
Well, I did about 15 years ago. I wrote the odd short comic piece for The Guardian, and then found it had turned into a weekly column, and it went on being a weekly column again for, I can't remember, about 3 months or whatever, and I thought I'd better stop before this becomes an addiction. I'm taken off to a clinic somewhere. But a lot of those pieces do appear in collections of columns. And I must admit, there are sometimes weeks now when I look at the newspapers and I think, I wish I was writing my column this week.
People should ask you, shouldn't they? They should think of it. I was rereading one of my favourites of Michael's columns, which is the one about God creating the earth and then showing it to his wife and saying, well, what do you think? Be honest with me. I can take any criticism. And she says, well, no, it's perfect. It's absolutely perfect. It's absolutely perfect. No, there must be something. And she says, well, I didn't really get the chihuahua. And he said, well, if you didn't get the chihuahua, you didn't understand anything about my work. And it's just wonderful.
Well, thank you. That was a wonderful memory, I must say. Much better memory than me. That was one of the later columns from this batch about 15 years ago.
Oh, it's wonderful. So funny. Yes, someone over here. And then we'll come to you.
I really enjoyed your book, My Father's Fortune, and I wondered if you are getting an increasing sense that you're more like him as the years go by.
Am I more like my father? Well, I said in the book I'm sometimes disconcerted now to realise from the inside that I've got a look on my face that I saw on his face from the outside. I've never rushed to the mirror and checked whether it looked the same from the outside, but I just feel from the inside I'm wearing one of my father's looks. But we were really quite different people. And one of the themes of the book is how we managed to find a way of getting on together. I was, apart from a very difficult period in my adolescence, when I became a terrible intellectual snob, I suppose as a way of establishing my independence from my family, we got on very well together. We were very fond of each other. But it took a lot of tolerance on my father's part, because he was very quick and I was very slow. And I used to drive him mad with my slowness. And in fact, his name for me when I was a small boy was Weary Willie, called after one of the tramps, because he thought I was in a daydream all the time. I was always doing things like going out to get another glass of water from the tap in the kitchen, pouring the glass of water and thanking the tap, and then making the mistake of telling him this, thinking it would amuse him, but it didn't amuse him. What a complete half-wit of a son he got. And when I began driving, he would very kindly lent me the car once to, we lived in the southwestern suburbs of London, to visit some relatives in Hampstead in North London. And on the way back, not knowing London very well, he was a salesman, he drove around London all the time, so he knew it extremely well, very proud of his knowledge of all the back streets. I got lost. And I told him the next morning at breakfast, to amuse him, that I'd gone 5 times through Elephant and Castle. Well, what amused him was not that I'd gone through it 5 times, but that I'd gone anywhere near the Elephant and Castle at all. And as I said in the book, he never let me forget that. I would boast that we'd been driving on our holidays in Switzerland or whatever. We'd gone over the Gotthard Pass one way and come back over the Great St. Bernard the other way or whatever, and he would say, "Much traffic at the Elephant?"
I'll come to you after that. The lady in the blue.
Had you always wanted to be a writer, or did you just sort of fall into doing it? And what were the influences that you got from growing up, and which influenced you to do so?
Yes, I did always want to be a writer. I didn't tell anyone this when I was a child because it seemed completely unreasonable ambition. I did say what seemed unreasonable enough that I wanted to be a journalist, which I did. I also wanted to be a journalist. Didn't differentiate clearly between the two things. And I think it was my father who got me into that. When I was about 7 years old, I wrote an essay about the house I should like to live in one day. And he said, well, perhaps you ought to be a journalist. And I suppose he just said it lightheartedly, the kind of things one says to a child. And somehow, maybe, I don't know what goes on in the back of my own brain, maybe it somehow lodged there and when it gradually took root.
And there's one here in the...
But I wrote enormous quantities of stuff when I was an adolescent, some of which I quoted in my father's fortune, and a lot of poetry, including 500-line epics and so forth. And I think you probably agree, Lynn, that the world has not lost a great deal because of my failure to pursue a career as a poet.
The theme of your book reminds me of a dilemma I had in 1965. I was at university on the entertainment committee, and we'd booked Little Richard to sing. And Little Richard sung, and then somebody came to us halfway through and said, "That's not Little Richard, I want my money back."
Oh, wonderful.
And we said, you know, he's black, he's singing a Wapapaloola, you know, it must be. But the question I have to ask you...
Hold on. My question to do, it wasn't Little Richard, or wasn't it?
But what do we do? We gave him his money back and threw him out. But
yeah, but was it? It actually was Little Richard.
It wasn't, and we
it
didn't...
wasn't.
It wasn't, and we didn't know for about 18 months that it wasn't.
Right, another plot coming
Little
up.
Richard
Right.
Little Richard's management had effectively franchised him. This was, of course...
Really, it was the management, the singer's management.
There were, we didn't know it at the time, several Little Richards touring the world. What do we know? We were only 18-year-old students.
What with the Little Richards and the two London Library bags? There must be another story coming up.
But I do actually have a question. The question I have to ask you is, once your book has been written, and your editors have put in their pennyworth, that's it. You mentioned with Noises Off that you rewrote it effectively after the first night because the third act didn't work. Have you rewritten it again and again and again based on audience reaction?
As I said, I rewrote Act 3 when it was playing at the Lyric Hammersmith where it opened, and went on rewriting until Nicky Henson, playing one of the parts, came and, on behalf of the rest of the cast, very much like the character who's playing, Gary, said, we're not going to learn any more versions. So then it transferred to the Savoy, and every time we had a new cast and had to re-rehearse, I rewrote the end of Act 3. When we went to America, I rewrote for Washington. When that production transferred to New York, I rewrote it again. When it was revived at the National Theatre in 2000, I rewrote quite radically. But I have to say, for this last production at the Old Vic, I haven't done any rewriting at all. This may be because I'm just sinking into a senile torpor, or possibly because the director this time was more scholarly, a rather scholarly director, and he was much more concerned with interpreting the existing text than with improving it. I got many phone calls from him with questions like, does he look around before he picks up the sardines or afterwards? I said, I haven't the faintest idea. He's just made it up. Anyway, he's done an absolutely wonderful production of it. So I think maybe I have now stopped rewriting that play.
I think, with regret, we should probably end it there, but that was the real Michael Frayn and the real Lynne Truss. Refunds, anyone? I think we'll definitely have them back, don't you? And next time, Michael will address us in Russian, and Lynn will summarise Proust on PowerPoint. Thank you both very much. Now, yes, I think a round of applause.